Good afternoon. I am so delighted to host this very special event, a conversation with three inspiring writers. All three of them are critically acclaimed and extremely successful, both in their homeland and outside of it. And all three of them are women as well, a thing not to be taken lightly, even in 2016. Anita Desai, who is staying here in Israel with her daughter, Kiran, for a month-long residency in Mishkenot Sha'ananim, was born and raised in India. She is the author of many novels and short stories, 3 times nominee for the Man Booker Prize. She received numerous literary prizes, among which the Winifred Holtby Memorial Prize, the Ribalo Prize, the Alberto Moravia Prize for Literature, and the Benson Medal of Royal Society of Literature, of which she is also a fellow. In 2014, she was awarded the Padma Bhushan, one of India's highest awards, and is a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books. Kiran Desai, born in India and educated in India, England, and the US, received the 2006 Man Booker Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award for her wonderful novel, The Inheritance of Loss. I have it here. And the Betty Trask Award for her debut novel, Hullabaloo in the Guava Orchard. Zeruya Shalev is one of Israel's most celebrated writers. Her novels has been translated into more than 20 languages, and she received many literary awards, among which the Israeli Akum Golden Feather Award, the German Corinne Prize, and the French Prix Femina Award for Foreign Literature. And she has also been one of my most meaningful sources of influence and inspiration in Israeli literature when I began writing fiction. So I'm twice as glad to meet here and in such good company. Okay, so the panel is entitled Literary Inheritance, and I would like to begin with the question of inheritance and its connection to literature. And it seems to me that one of the recurring themes in each of your books is damaged or troubled relationships between parents and children, parents who alienate their children, or else parents who live through their children, children who live through their parents, hanging on to them, not being able to create their own life. And let me read from a quote from one of my favorite quotes from Zeruya Shalev's novel Love Life. This is a scene where the protagonist, Yara Korman, is looking at a picture of her father in his youth, her father and her current lover, which was his childhood friend and also her mother's lover. I identified Arya easily, tall and black-haired, with a broad smile exposing white teeth, a smile I didn't like, too confident, too arrogant, a little stupid in his arrogance, and next to him a short, fair boy with a pale, almost spiritual smile, so different from that of his friend, and nevertheless there was expectation in his face, the expectation of happiness, and the more I looked at him, the more difficult it was for me to part from him, and I wondered which of them I would have chosen if I had been alive then, if I had been my mother. And it seems to me that the question of inheritance, the things you inherit versus the path that you pave for yourself, also bears some biographical and poetic implications for each of you, since you all come from or created a family of writers. Anita and Kiran, you are a mother and a daughter who are both writers, and Zeruya, you also come from a very distinguished family of literary critics and writers, and you're also married to a writer, Eyal Meged. And my question is, is literary inheritance a burden or reward? Is it? It's a big question.
You want me to start? Well, okay. Well, I guess it is a burden, and also it's a huge gift. My private case is completely different than yours because my father was a literary critic. He was not a writer. And I think it is even much more dangerous to have a father who is a literary critic than having a writer as a father or as a mother, because he exposed me to so much criticism. And as a young writer, I have to admit it was not easy. And I was a very young writer. I was 6. I was 6 years old when I started to write poetry. I was 10 years old when I wrote my first novel. I'm not talking about masterpieces, of course. But still, I always felt this kind of burden, this kind of fear. I always felt that my writing is not good enough, that I should do much better, that he's not satisfied enough, and I remember growing up with this feeling. So it was not easy, but of course, on the other hand, my father used to expose me and my brother to the works he loved and admired, like first of all the Bible stories, and then the Iliad and Odyssey. And he even read us the Metamorphosis of Kafka when we were 5 years old. So. So it is quite a heavy inheritance, I would say.
I also grew up with my mother's bookshelves, and I think that I still remember exactly how every book looked on the shelves of our Delhi bookshelf, and so I was extraordinarily lucky for that reading taste and for that international bookshelf. I think at that time, growing up in India, it was such a quiet country. It still hadn't opened its doors to the big world. This is 1970s and early 80s. So the only way the world came to us was through books. And we had this wonderful bookshelf with books from Japan and Russia and Latin America and Africa, all over the world. But I, when I was young, did not want to become a writer. I wanted to be a scientist and a biologist. And I went to college and studied ecology. And I remember embarking on an experiment, and it was called cannibalism of the common house cricket. Do you remember that? And all the crickets died. Yes. They ate each other. And I realized somewhere along the line, as this continued, I had a bee experiment, wasps visiting flowers experiment, and all these things. And I realized that I was really, I think, writing fiction. I really wasn't a scientist. I was writing these fictional scientific episodes. And I wrote a story, took a class in the United States where you can study creative writing, took a class, immediately felt so happy. And perhaps it was, I think I felt it as if it was a return to a very old childhood rhythm, because I had grown up at the bookshelf. I'd grown up in a writer's house. So very strong sense of how to live as an author. It was a very familiar rhythm to me, the writing life. And after having left India, having left England, having arrived in the United States, new country, new place, it suddenly felt like coming home. And that feeling has persisted. There isn't really much of a home other than this feeling. So,
did you ever feel the need to rebel against the literary inheritance of yours? Poetically speaking, I mean.
Poetically speaking, yes, I'm thinking, I've only written 2 books so far. I'm working on the third, and I'm never conscious of the influence. I always think I'm writing something very different in a very different style, and perhaps the style is very different from my mother's work. But over and over again, people have pointed out to me, and critics have pointed out to me and said, this really reminds me of your mother's book.
It's true.
The first book, My Hullabaloo in the Guava Orchard, I thought I was being influenced by Calvino and Marquez. And someone said, oh, it's exactly like your mother's book, Fire on the Mountain. And then when I looked at it, I thought, yes, it is. Second book, too. Very different in style, but I look back and see the parallels.
It seems to me all 3 of us agree that what influenced us in our childhood, in our beginnings, were the books in the house. Not always the parents or the siblings, but the bookshelves, the books that we all read together. And my parents were not writers, certainly, but they did have shelves full of wonderful books. And like Kiran, I can also remember the look and feel of each book as I took them off the shelf. And I remember going to the library down the road with my mother to collect books, and those were the great influence. And although there were no other writers in my family, my parents obviously observed that as soon as I got home from school, I hurried into a corner, sat down at a table with a book, notebook and pen, and filled one notebook after the other. So they named me the writer in the family without ever having seen anything I wrote. I also had a sister who, if you handed her a doll, she would immediately cut it up in order to stitch it up again and bandage it. So they named her the doctor in the family, and she immediately did become a doctor. So I think my parents saw the potential in each child, but in no way tried to influence it. So I can't say it was a burden in any way. It was just enough encouragement to give one a sense of identity. Yes, I said, I'm the writer in the family, my sister's the doctor in the family. We accepted that. As for my children, I have 4 of them. 2 of them read all the time, always had a book near them to be able to pick up and read. 2 of them would turn their faces away. They never wanted to look at a book at all. So I can't say that it's inherited. And Kiran's the only writer, the only one who took to writing. And as far as I'm concerned, it's made for the most wonderful companionship, that apart from the family relation, the family affection and feelings, we also share our work, our profession, so it makes an extra strong bond, I feel. So I wouldn't call it a burden, not that I see it as such ever.
Anita, in one of your stories that I like the most, it's called The Artist's Life, you depict the sort of the portrait of the artist as a young girl, and it seems to me that the story implies that writing, it's not about writing, but that art actually challenges conventional family life. But in other occasions, I think that you mentioned a few times that the stressful times, the times that you were raising children, were actually the highly productive times in terms of your writing. And so I wanted to ask all of you, actually, what does family does to writing? What does motherhood does to writing? Does it interfere with writing or rather inspire it?
No, by the time I had children, I was already writing constantly. I'd already written a bit and knew I would continue doing that. People often ask me, how do you manage to write when you have 4 children in the house? I very quickly found a way to do it. After all, they did sleep occasionally from time to time, and I would rush and immediately
my kids.
Pick up my book.
They never
still
sleep.
Don't. They'll come to it.
Hope so.
And then they started going to school, and I'd have 3 hours in the morning to work, and I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I was waiting for that moment. I'd rush straight to my desk. I wrote very fast. And I fell into a particular calendar. When they had school holidays, I put aside my work. When the school reopened, I pulled out my work. It worked very well. And I felt if I didn't have children, I would miss a great deal. Yeah. I wouldn't be in touch with life, the changing of times, of generations. And I can only say they fed my work, they nourished my work, rather than in any way hampered it or destroyed it. If they resented the time I spent at my desk, I don't know. I don't know. I could ask Kiran. Yes.
No, I didn't resent the time you spent at your desk because I think you were very discreet about it. I remember you would work while we went to school, and then when we came home, you would stop working, which is it seems remarkable to me because I have the exact opposite situation. I live alone. I don't have children, and I have enormous quantities of time, and I don't know if that's a good thing. I mean, that's its own challenge. It's extremely luxurious in many ways. At the same time, given I have no constraint. I write and I write and I write endlessly. I have breakfast at my desk, I have lunch at my desk, and I mostly have dinner at my desk. So slowly I've transferred my entire living life into a writing life. And sometimes I feel very strange, as if I'm living in a very surreal world that's not a real world at all, as if I've completely transferred myself into a book. And therefore, over the last years, this third book that I'm writing in this luxurious way, I think I wrote about 2,000 or 3,000 pages, and then thought, this is ridiculous. I mean, I could go on forever, and then I would just die at the end, and I would have spent my whole life just having transferred it into this, and I have to stop and make a book out of it. And when I looked at what I had, it was terrifying. And I had a moment of severe panic because I hadn't done any of that. I hadn't, conducted myself with any sense of discipline or any thought of a book. And I hadn't forced myself all along. I had endless time, so I didn't think, oh no, now I need to really make a plot. I have to know where this is going. So I'm facing that problem as an author. Sometimes it feels, it also, I think this also goes through from being an immigrant, I think, from having lost a sort of landscape and then lost a certain kind of life. And so everything became a book. Yeah, yes.
So, yeah.
Well, I was listening to you and I felt that your life is my fantasy. Yes, it is. My situation is so much different, but still I will not complain. First of all, because of course, pragmatically, of course, it's easier to write when you don't have children. And of course, they interfere with your inspiration in many ways in the pragmatic level. But my private experience shows me that in many other levels it's the other way around, and I feel that being a mother is such a huge inspiration and such a huge contribution to my books. Because I think writing and being a mother, it's quite similar. I mean, being very, very patient, being very devoted to someone else, being try to identify with so many different ages and so many different people, like they are in many ways, like they are the characters of my writing. And I think I told you that I started writing when I was very young, but still I completed my first book, which was a book of poetry, when I was pregnant for the first time. Only then I felt strong enough to do it. And my first book of poetry came out a few months after I gave birth to my daughter, and then throughout life I feel how the motherhood and my writing they enrich each other, and I think motherhood enrich the emotional abilities, and then it reflects in the writing. I hope so. But don't worry, you have enough emotional abilities. I read your book, and it is so wonderful. So without having children, you do it the best, the best that it's possible.
Well, I always wonder that if you do have children, can you be entirely honest about, could you be able to write a book about a mother who dislikes her children? That would be very hard to do, I imagine. You did?
I'm hoping to do it soon.
No, really, can I? Yes. No, my first novel. Well, you ask about rebellions, so maybe I can add few words about this interesting issue. But yes, my first novel, which is it is not translated into many languages like my second one. It was a very provocative book, very surrealistic novel, and it deals with the difficulties of a young mother. And yes, I think that there are many paragraphs in the book that I wouldn't like my daughter to read now, and I feel a bit embarrassed about them because I was so honest. I was too honest. Now I regret it. But if you ask about rebellions, I remember that when I showed the galas of the book to my father before publication, he said, well, I told you he was very critical. He said, don't publish it. Yes, it's too, he said, it's still not good enough. You have to work on it. I even remember that he said, it's like an abortion. Yes, it was not easy. It was not easy to listen. And I decided to rebel against his advice, and I published this book, and I got awful reviews. the reviews were so negative that I thought, well, maybe my father was right. Maybe I should keep it in the, in the dark, in my dark desk. And then, which is even more funny, I think that my next novel was kind of different rebellion. When I was writing Love Life, it's a very daring book, also erotically speaking. And I was not aware, while I was writing the book, I was not aware to this fact. It was so natural for me to write about this sex relationship because it was, this is what the story was about, and it was such an important part of the story. But then I remember when I came from the publishing house with the 3 first copies of the new novel, Love Life, I went first to my parents' apartment and I gave my father the first copy of the book, and I was very proud and happy. And then I came home, and suddenly I realized that tonight my Puritan father is going to read this un-Puritan novel. And I suddenly became so scared that he might get a heart attack, that maybe he will not survive this book. And I remember I immediately called my mother and I shared my concern with her. Yes. And she had a very creative idea. She was a painter. And she said, no, don't worry, I will take I will mark the paragraph that he shouldn't read. I will read it first. I will mark the paragraphs for him, and I will tell him to skip those paragraphs. And I said, okay, I didn't have a better idea. So, and that's what she did. The whole night she worked on it. And then 2 days later, my father called me, and he sounded so relieved and so satisfied, and he praised the book in such a generous way that I started to suspect that maybe he only read the marked paragraphs. and I still don't know the truth.
So funny.
Let's talk a little bit about politics. Okay, we're in Israel after all.
Oh.
Yes. Kiran, in one of the most powerful paragraphs from your book, The Inheritance of Loss, you describe one of the characters, Jian. Do I spell the name correctly?
Yeah.
A young man, as he watches a group of Nepali revolutionaries from the outside at this point. But he's about to join them eventually, and I would like to read this paragraph that I really like. As he floated through the market, Jian had a feeling of history being wrought, its wheels churning under him, for the men were behaving as if they were being featured in a documentary of war, and Jian could not help but look at the scene already from the angle of nostalgia. And this particular description of a political outburst that is also predictable and sort of going through the motions was very painful for me to read as an Israeli. And I wanted to ask all 3 of you, how do you deal as writers who come from very conflicted areas with this documentary of war? How do you deal with, do you feel an obligation to represent political or ethnic tensions in your writing? Anita.
I think one may start off by writing a very different book, not being aware that you're going to even mention current situations. But they're bound to enter into it. You realize that you can't possibly keep that atmosphere, that pressure out of your book. It's bound to seep in some way. It can take a very long time. I'm not somebody who immediately sets down the events as they take place. in my case, they take a very, very long time. I was a child of 10 when the partition of India occurred with an enormous amount of violence and upheaval. For instance, when the school year ended, my class was made up of 50% of Hindu girls and 50% of Muslim girls. When the school reopened after the summer vacation, the Muslim girls had all vanished. There wasn't one left, or perhaps a very few left, because they had all moved to Pakistan in that time. I was 10 years old and I...
You want your microphone? I just saw somebody.
Oh, what do I do?
You just hold it very
Oh.
close, maybe.
Certainly at the age of 10, I was not able to write about how my feelings at that time. It took many, many years. But when I wrote a book called Clear Light of Day, that was very central to the book. It was about a family, siblings, growing up in the quiet old Delhi house that I had grown up in. But the violence was flickering all around, and the pressure was felt all around them. And that entered into my book without it having been my central intention or occupation, but there was no keeping that out. And later on I wrote a book about the Urdu language that the Muslim population of Old Delhi used and that I'd heard all around me all through my childhood. And I realized was beginning to fade out of daily life. It was being overtaken by Hindi and Punjabi, and Urdu was fading. So I felt a great need to somehow preserve that tradition, that culture, when Urdu was spoken just as much as Hindi had been spoken. But in my case, it always took a very long time, many years, for these events to filter through my consciousness and of my being able to address them, not directly, but always indirectly. I'm a great believer in some lines that the poet Emily Dickinson wrote. She said, "Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies." And I realized that that's the path that I've always followed, the circuitous path, not the direct one.
When I was writing my last book, Inheritance of Loss, well, I should say, first of all, I sometimes read American novelists or who seem to be able to write for the entire career, spend the entire career working without ever addressing the subject of politics. Politics never seems to enter the landscape, and you can have sometimes you just read people who are, you read a campus novel or something like that, and you have these feel as if it's possible for them to live in a world where politics doesn't really enter and they don't really have to think about it, and therefore also they've fallen out of the general political discourse. And in India that isn't true. You don't have the luxury of being able to write, I think, without politics invading your fiction. And writers are part of the political discourse, and I think that's probably true of Israel from everything I've seen. When I was working on Inheritance of Loss, my first desire was just to capture the immigrant world of New York, not the wealthy elite layer, but that kind of muddled, illegal mix in the basement kitchens of New York, which where the entire non-Western world seemed to be meeting for the first time. We all grew up thinking, in our respective corners of the world, we all grew up thinking of the center of power. For us it was England, and then briefly the Soviet Union, and then the United States. And I know if you came from Latin America, there were different centers of power, but we were not meeting sideways. It's also true of taking a flight. You had to go through Europe or through United States to get to these other corners of the world. And there wasn't really a direct conversation. And then suddenly I realized it was happening in this layer, in this level of New York. And I started trying to write about that. I didn't expect to return to this corner of India up in the mountains and to find any parallel there. I began linking it back when I thought of the people I was writing about in these basement kitchens of New York. And then I began thinking of my grandparents' journeys between India and the Western world, less powerful world to more powerful world. And I began to wonder if I inherited some of those emotional patterns and how different those worlds were. Globalized world, colonial world. Is the world flat? Is the world round? You may have read Thomas Friedman's The World is Flat. I happen to think it's still round. But so that was how I went back to that landscape. And then I found other unexpected parallels, questions of class, power, who belongs where, shifting borders. How long does it take when you arrive in a place to belong there? Which language should be taught in schools, you know? So I found questions of migrant labor. So all these questions, and that's how I constructed this book. But I hadn't planned on it. I realized, however, that I couldn't write without thinking of these very deeply political matters.
So yeah, a question for you in this context. You were often addressed, sometimes even criticized, for being a writer who does not regularly engage with Israeli politics, so to speak, but instead chooses to focus on the private sphere, the home and everything that's in it. And to me, sometimes it seemed like a poetic choice of yours, maybe even a political declaration in itself, as if to say, I will not join the men's club of writing about the occupation, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, etc. But in your latest novel, Pain, you actually wrote for the first time, I think, if I'm not mistaken, about the connection between the political pain and the wounds caused by love, as your female protagonist, Iris, is wounded in a terrorist attack and at the same time falls in love again with her high school sweetheart. And I was wondering what caused this change in your writing? What made the political pervade the also private lives of your characters?
Yes, it's a very complex issue for me, because I think that at the beginning I only felt in a very intuitive way that maybe it was also kind of a rebellion, that the situation here in Israel can control my life, it can influence my life in a very deep way, but I don't want to let it influence my writing. I felt that I need my freedom, and I don't want to feel this obligation to write about the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example, because I'm looking for my own way. I'm looking for what is more meaningful for me. But slowly, I felt that the Israeli reality is entering my books in many ways, in indirect ways, like even in the style. I think that the style of all my books is very intense. You can feel the Israeli tension, even if I don't write about it. You can feel the fear in the streets, because it is mentioned in many tiny ways, and it was enough for me until I wanted to open more and more windows, and I think that it started in my previous novel, in The Remains of Love, where I was looking for ways to let the outer reality, the political reality, meet the private sphere. And this is what I'm trying to do, because for me this conflict between the private life and the political situation is very meaningful and very important. So in The Remains of Love, the one of the characters is a lawyer for human rights. So he deals with some of the conflict between human rights and security. And in my last novel, In Pain, the main character is being injured in a terror attack in Jerusalem. And I tried to show how people react to political issues in a very private way, in a very intimate way. And I feel that it is always more meaningful to write about the intimate world than about the political world. So, for example, this Israeli family that the mother is being injured, and of course she suffers a lot, and the whole family suffers so much, but they never blame the terrorists. They never blame the suicide bomber. They don't blame the Palestinians. They only blame themselves for the most tiny daily acts of this morning when she was injured. The little daughter wanted a special hair design. The boy was hiding in the toilet. The husband went early to work, and the whole this is what made the mother go out in this specific hour to this specific road to bring the kids to school, and this is how she was injured. But the whole attitude towards the event is like it was a family event and not a political event. And I like to illustrate this issue, because this is how I feel life in Israel.
Do we still have time for... Yes?
We have time.
All three of you are citizens of the world. Anita and Kiran, you were both born in India, but you've lived in America for many years, and you also write in English, which is not your first language. And Zeruya, you travel the world regularly promoting the translations of your books, and as such you serve as a sort of a middleman, having to represent your Hebrew novels in English and maybe even represent Israel in a sense. And I was wondering, how do you manage the role of the outsider? Do you feel as if this looking from the outside has affected your writing?
Well, I think if you take the writing life as your profession, to be a writer, you're already making yourself an outsider, because you've become not a participant as much as you've become an observer. You're standing aside, observing. Of course you're participating too, but your role as a writer, as an artist, is to observe, perhaps to criticize, perhaps to praise. But anyway, you've already put yourself in the shadows, in the hope that you are not going to be observed. Your book will be, your work will be, but not you personally. And I think that's what you carry with you wherever you go. You can be an outsider in your own life, in your own country, in your own society, and so it's not all that strange to go out into another country, another part of the world, and feel yourself an outsider there too. It's something that you accept, that you deal with daily.
I have found, I do feel the sense of being an outsider always. Felt it even when I was growing up in India. However, I am sometimes disturbed by I am very disturbed by having to be a diplomat and having to travel to countries and being asked, questions that don't really have to do with my book or literature at all, but constantly being asked to explain India to the rest of the world. And I feel so sorry for Israeli authors, really, because this must be a terrible problem. And so hard to have to constantly emphasize, no, that's not a question I should be answering. And it's far more complicated a situation because people also want you to simplify it, not just explain it, but simplify it, and to have to constantly complicate it, which you do in your own work. And then when you go out on stage, we are not politicians, and then to have to simplify it. And I think it's causing a lot of problems because then as an author back at home in India, you're very much criticized for talking about what, it's perceived you have no idea what you're talking about, frankly, because you're an Indian living abroad for one thing, you're an Indian writing in English for another thing. You're seen as being a member of an elite class for yet another thing. And in fact, every Indian author would go through this because they can never speak for all the different complexities. And each level accuses the other one of not knowing what they're talking about. And you feel as if your work is being transformed into something representative, not a novel, but not a character, but the character has become representative. My character Gyan, who you mentioned earlier, people would say, well, why are you writing about Indian Nepalis in this way? So then it becomes like you fall into a very different world. That's not a literary world. And I think authors from all over, particularly the non-Western world, face this. I think authors from the Western world are very protected because they come from big landscapes when they're mostly talking to audiences who are much like themselves. So they write for people like themselves. Their books are bought by people like themselves. So they don't have to play this role, and I think they're very, very lucky.
Yes, you're so right. But the Israeli writers, we are not so lucky. It's quite a nightmare to go abroad and to listen to all those questions. First of all, I got used to this question again and again and again. Why don't you write about politics? How can you live in a place like Israel and write about intimate life or about family life? And it is so hard for them to accept it that they are trying to interpret my books in symbolic ways. So every fighting couple is, of course, a symbol to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So sometimes they say, "Tell me, did you mean it that the wife is the Palestinian and the husband is the Israeli, or the other way around?" But there are only two options for many of my readers abroad and many of the journalists that ask me for interviews. It's really hard for them to accept this fact. And wherever I go, I feel that my country is on my shoulders, very heavy. And sometimes I'm flattered over things that I have nothing to do with, or sometimes I'm accused when I'm completely have nothing to do with it too. And the whole situation is is very tense, is very unpleasant, and I try to find my way to explain, to not to justify the government on the one hand, but on the other hand, not to criticize my country, because my country is always so criticized and so attacked everywhere that I don't feel that it is my role to come and to add my own criticism. So I try to show the complexity. I try to show that yes, there are two tragedies here in this place, and since I am Israeli, since I am Jewish, I try to talk about our side of the tragedy, about our daily life, full of fears sometimes, full of terror attacks, and also full of guilt feelings from time to time. But you're right, sometimes it is hard to explain, and people are so used to this black and white vision that I find it very hard to change it.
Anita and Kiran, do you feel as if the very experience of immigration actually changed your writing, or does it change writing itself?
To tell you the truth, when I first left India and went to work abroad, I was afraid that I would never be able to write again, because I was leaving behind the material of my books. And this was enforced by the feeling that I was now in a society I couldn't write about. Not that I didn't have many things to say, but it had all been said so much better by the writers to whom it was the natural home. They could understand it so much better. I always had the feeling, I really don't understand what's happening, what is going on. I can't write about it. And I was afraid that I would be silenced. I'd never write another word. But out of long habit, ever since I was a child, I sat down to start writing again, of course, and found myself writing once again about the most familiar scene to me, which was India, which I thought I'd left behind, I'd never be able to write about. And I realized that really a writer in a way is like a turtle. Everything you've inherited, everything you've learned, belonged to, you don't abandon it at the roadside and leave it behind. You carry it with you wherever you go. And I've very rarely written about the foreign countries that I've lived in, England or America, at the most very small stories, never a full book. It's only when I write about India that I can write, fully, openly, frankly, deeply. And I suppose that's how I shall continue being or writing.
Thank you. I think that I did have a bit of a panic, and at one point, because I began writing when I was in my 20s. I left India when I was 14 or 15. My first book was set in India, the second book half and half. And I sometimes talk with other Indian authors in New York, and there are very many. And several of us, I think, feel the same way, that there's this anxiety of subject matter, and how long do you continue writing about the country you've left behind, how to move into another landscape. And I see even someone like, the author Jhumpa Lahiri, some of you may have read her work, and you see she writes so much about families, immigrant families, often very tenderly about the older generation. And I've heard her say that she doesn't feel she can write that way anymore. And latest book is a memoir set in Italy, learning Italian, and I can see in it there some stories, and you can see the beginnings of an author trying to make her way into a new way of working and a new way of writing. And so I feel a bit as if I do face that process. I do think about it quite a bit. But when I calmed down after after this stage of, well, not loud panic, but quiet panic, I realized that it was okay. There are plenty of things to write about, and that you can write from the place of diaspora, that being an Indian author, even if there isn't a firm geographical location, there's a very firm emotional location. And it's possible to write from that emotional location. Sometimes I feel caught by something else, which is a very old form of Indian storytelling. And I followed that, I think, in my first book. I felt very caught by in the way Indians tell stories, the way you go to a dinner party and the way people talk and the way people joke. And I felt very caught by that rhythm. And I didn't feel as if that fit my new subject matter. So sometimes I struggle with the form, and I think the story informs the form, and I can see great changes happening in my writing there, and a great struggle for me in that place of my work right now.
Let's talk about one of the perks of this shady profession: success. All three of you are very successful writers, successful in the sense that writing is your main occupation, if I'm not mistaken. I, for instance, cannot wait for the moment when I can leave my day job. And I was wondering if there was a moment when you told yourself, that's it, I got where I wanted, I no longer need a day job, I can live off writing. And is this a source of relief, or is this a frightening moment?
Well, it took me many years to leave my job as an editor. During my first years, after I published my book of poetry and then my first novel, of course I had to keep it. Then when I when I published Love Live and it was very successful, I started to think maybe I can leave it, but I was really afraid because writing is not a stable profession, and I felt that I need to keep my work as an editor too, and I was very frustrated because I had to give so much of my time and creativity to other books, and I didn't have enough time to write my own books. And then finally, I think it was 10-12 years ago, I made this decision and I stopped being an editor. But then I realized that leading this kind of career is also a full-time job in itself. I mean, I won't complain, but still, so many reading tours and so many emails and interviews, and I think there is not even one day that I can do only writing. There is so much to do except writing, but of course it is still a privilege. And but I have to say that it is not so pastoral as you can imagine when you want to be. When you dream about being a successful writer, I had no idea what it means. But tell me about it.
When I was writing my last book, I didn't have a job, and however, I was very badly off. For many years, I didn't have much money, and I lived with roommates in New York, and I finally lived with 3 roommates and a dying dog. And my landlord was a former clown from the Ringling Brothers. And there was quite a household. And I was finishing work on Inheritance of Loss. It was it's funny now in retrospect, but it was very traumatic. I was in an extraordinarily bad mood, refused to work, and actually for long periods of time while I was working, writing this book, I was getting up in the morning, making coffee, getting back into bed, reading until I was propelled out of my bed to my desk. Not you, but I think many members of the family saying, get a job, Kiran, just get a job. You have to get a job. And I wouldn't get a job. I just refused. And then there was a time when it was very hard to publish this book, to find a publisher in some countries, and it was quite a long struggle. So I paid quite a price, and then I moved from 3 roommates, and the dog died, to 1 roommate, and then finally to live on my own seemed such an achievement. And in New York, you start in the apartment with rats and no light, and actually a roommate who was from Zanzibar, whom I based the character in Inheritance of Loss on someone I knew and lived with at that time of my life. And then very slowly you make your way 1 level up and 1 level up to where you have a window with sunlight. So that's how it was. But I'm 44, and that's where I am now. I just achieved a window with sunlight and an ability to be on my own in this way. So, that's how and I do think that's success. And I look at the window and I look at the light and I think, oh, this is the light that comes after war. It feels like that. This is the peace that comes after war. And I appreciate it in a way. I'm always conscious of that. Oh, look at that. Look at the way the sun is coming in, and here I am at my desk without, an alcoholic roommate and someone else having eaten, drank, someone else is, all the milk is gone, all of those terrible questions. And, yeah. You never had to live with roommates.
No, I lived with children. In fact, I seem to have done things the other way around. I was only a writer and a mother for many, many years, many decades. And then I realized at one point that I couldn't manage an independent life this way. So I started a second career very late in my life. I was nearly 50 when I started teaching. But I was very fortunate because at that time
Creative writing?
Yes, at that time I was in the United States, and the colleges there actually had this course called creative writing. I had never known there was such a thing. I'd never taught such a thing or studied such a thing before. So it was an experiment. And I did it for 15 years. And
did you like it?
It was very hard. I'm not a natural-born teacher at all. It was hard for me. And it certainly cut down on my writing time. So I was happy when I could retire, give it up, and return to what came naturally to me, which was just being a writer again.
Do you feel the need to encourage other female writers or young writers in general? Oh my God. Okay, time flies when you're having fun. Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful conversation.